He bought a single mother at a secret auction so that she would bear him a child. But what she did later shocked him. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. Rain slid down the cracked windshield in crooked paths, catching the orange glare of a distant streetlight. Inside the rusted Honda, parked at the back of a crumbling strip mall, Taryn sat perfectly still, her hands tucked into the sleeves of an oversized hoodie. She could hear her daughter's wheezing breath in the back seat, rhythmic but tight, like a whisper constantly interrupted. Maya, 6 years old and smaller than most children her age, slept curled in a ball under two blankets, her little chest rising and falling too quickly. Taryn glanced over her shoulder at the child and then closed her eyes for a moment, willing the numbness in her bones to give way to something, anything, other than helplessness. The car smelled of damp clothing, plastic food containers, and the faint sweetness of children's shampoo. Taryn hadn't had a real bed in over 3 weeks. Ever since their eviction, she and Maya had been living out of the Honda, showering occasionally at the women's shelter across town and eating what little she could scavenge or buy with the few coins she earned collecting aluminum cans. The nights had begun to cool in Atlanta, creeping toward winter with a quiet ruthlessness. She'd had to duct tape the rear window when it started leaking. That morning, the tape peeled loose again. Cold wind seeped in now, touching the sleeping child's cheek. Taryn shifted and reached back carefully, adjusting the blanket over her daughter's face. It hadn't always been this way. 2 years ago, she'd had a job at a diner on Piedmont Avenue, a small apartment, and a neighbor who'd occasionally watch Maya when she pulled doubles. But then came the cuts. First the shifts, then the pay, then the job. She remembered the day clearly. The manager avoided eye contact, muttered something about declining revenues, and handed her an envelope with her last check. It had been raining that day, too. She applied for assistance, food stamps, Medicaid, anything, but the bureaucracy moved slowly, and Maya's health didn't wait. The girl had developed asthma after a bout with pneumonia 2 winters back, and Taryn could no longer afford her inhalers. That had been the beginning of the spiral. From late rent notices to eviction, from couch surfing to the front seat of a car. Each step chipped away a little more of her pride until survival became the only thing that mattered. A knock on the window startled her. She tensed, heart leaping, but it was only Tony, a night security guard who worked nearby and sometimes brought her leftover sandwiches. She rolled down the window halfway. "Still here?" he asked softly, holding out a plastic bag with something warm inside. "Turkey wrap tonight." Taryn took it with a whisper of thanks. Tony didn't linger. He never asked questions, never made her feel ashamed. He simply nodded and walked off into the dark parking lot, flashlight swaying. She split the sandwich in half even though Maya was asleep. Her own hunger gnawed at her, but she wrapped one half in a napkin and tucked it under her daughter's backpack. Maya would need it more. The next morning brought little hope. The rain stopped, but the clouds still hung heavy and low. Taryn started the car to warm it up, the engine coughing twice before turning over. They drove to the downtown resource center, hoping for a spot in the shelter. There were none. She waited anyway, sitting on a folding chair with Maya huddled in her lap, the girl's breath crackling with each exhale. The staff apologized with tired eyes and offered a pamphlet for emergency medical services. By noon, Taryn stood in the pharmacy aisle of a grocery store, staring at inhalers locked behind a plastic case. A clerk eyed her warily as she did the math in her head. Even with her food voucher, now expired, she couldn't afford it. She left without buying anything. That evening, back in the car, Maya had a coughing fit that left her gasping. Taryn held her tightly, rocking her, whispering lullabies and prayers to a God she wasn't sure was listening. She told herself she wouldn't cry, not in front of her daughter. But as the girl finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, Taryn leaned her forehead against the steering wheel and let the tears come silently. The next day changed everything. She met Claudia at the free clinic, an older woman with glossy nails and expensive perfume that couldn't hide the years of wear in her eyes. They waited beside each other for over an hour before Claudia struck up a conversation. There was something unusual in her tone, a mix of pity and calculation. "You have that look," Claudia said. "What look?" Taryn asked, defensive. "The one that says you're drowning but still too proud to scream." Taryn turned away, but Claudia didn't stop talking. She spoke about options, not the kind on government forms, but the kind whispered behind tinted windows and private doors. She mentioned a program, a contract. Not prostitution, she clarified. Something more transactional. Taryn was about to walk away when Claudia said one more thing. "You can save your daughter." That night, with Maya asleep and the car parked near the freight tracks, Taryn turned the words over in her head again and again. She thought about all the applications that went nowhere, all the hands that turned her away, all the doors that closed before she even knocked. 2 days later, she made the call. A man with a clipped accent answered and gave her instructions. She was to take a bus to Denver. Upon arrival, she would be picked up by someone from the agency, evaluated, and, if selected, introduced to a client. She would live in comfort, be paid handsomely, and never speak of it again. Taryn asked what would happen to Maya. They assured her the child would be placed in a private pediatric clinic, the best in the state, fully paid for. She would be safe, warm, and well-fed. That night, Taryn didn't sleep. She memorized Maya's face in the dim dome light, counting her eyelashes, brushing her fingers over the soft curls behind her ear. The thought of handing her over, even to safety, felt like peeling her heart from her chest. But what other choice was there? At dawn, she bought 2 bus tickets with the last of her savings and fed her daughter from a vending machine at the Greyhound terminal. The trip took over 20 hours. Maya slept most of the way, her little body curled into Taryn's side. Taryn kept a hand on her daughter's chest, counting breaths. Denver was colder, drier, and unfamiliar. A man in a suit met them at the station. He didn't smile. He took them to a glass building on the edge of downtown and handed Taryn a clipboard. Paperwork, waivers, medical disclosures. She barely read them. Maya was taken to the clinic that evening. Taryn wasn't allowed to go with her. The nurse promised to call and said the girl would have her own room, toys, and tutors. Taryn nodded and held her daughter tighter than she ever had before. "I'll come back," she whispered into the girl's ear. "I promise." Maya didn't cry. She just blinked and held on to her teddy bear. That night, Taryn was taken to a suite in a luxury hotel. She was given a silk dress, high heels, and told to wash and prepare. The event would begin at 8. In the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The makeup couldn't cover the shadows under her eyes, the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers trembled as she zipped the dress. She stood straighter, practiced a neutral expression. She wasn't here for them. She was here for Maya. At precisely 8 o'clock, she was escorted to the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in golden light. Classical music played softly. Men in suits mingled, sipping champagne, speaking in low tones. Along one wall stood 10 women, each in a number, each silent. Taryn was assigned number 14. When her number was called, she stepped forward. The lights made her squint. She felt their eyes crawl over her skin like insects. She locked her knees and held her chin high. The bidding started slow. A voice at the back offered 20. Another raised to 30. Then silence. A new voice, calm and low, offered 50. Heads turned. A tall white man near the corner of the room lowered his hand after speaking. He had silver hair, a weathered face, and held a cane at his side. His gaze was unreadable. No one else countered. "Sold," came the voice from the podium. Taryn was escorted back behind the curtains. Her stomach turned, but she held her breath steady. A woman handed her a thick envelope and said, "You leave tonight." That night, as the city of Denver glittered beneath her, Taryn sat in the back of a black car, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The man did not speak. He didn't even look at her. And though the seat was warm and the ride smooth, all she felt was cold. The car moved like a shadow through the streets of Denver, silent and smooth, its windows darkened so that even the city's distant lights were swallowed in black. Taryn sat with her back straight, hands still folded in her lap, unsure whether she was more afraid of what she was going toward or what she'd left behind. Her fingers twitched every few moments, as if her body needed to keep moving to believe this was real. She couldn't shake the image of Maya's face as she had been taken away. A quick hug, a whispered promise, and then her daughter disappearing into the back of a medical van, driven to the clinic Taryn had been assured was state-of-the-art. She had no address, no contact information, only the word of strangers. Her stomach tightened. She hadn't eaten since a stale sandwich from a vending machine the night before, but hunger was the last thing on her mind. The man beside her hadn't said a word since they'd left the hotel. He wore a sleek black coat, the collar stiff and high, and carried himself like a man used to giving orders. His silence wasn't dismissive. It was clinical, the silence of someone who did not see the person beside him as requiring conversation. Eventually, the car veered into an underground parking garage and eased into a reserved space, marked only with a single white X. They exited into a private elevator, sleek and chrome-lined, that rose without sound. When the doors opened, Taryn found herself facing another woman, tall, composed, in a gray suit with a tablet in her hands. "Welcome," she said, her tone even and practiced. "Please follow me." Taryn obeyed without question. They moved down a long hallway with carpet so plush it swallowed their footsteps. At the end, a heavy double door opened automatically, revealing a suite where 3 other women were already waiting. The room looked like a designer's idea of femininity. Soft lighting, pastel cushions, a vanity table stacked with cosmetics, and a mirrored wall that made the space feel twice as large. The other women didn't speak, only nodded. Each had the same look, alert, quiet, suspended between fear and calculation. Taryn was led to a changing room where a navy blue evening gown hung from a padded hanger. It was tasteful, expensive, modest even, but the message was clear. You are being prepared for inspection. A pair of nude heels sat below it, the soles unused. On the dresser, someone had arranged makeup, jewelry, perfume. She washed up quickly, trying not to stare too long at her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked like someone else, older than her years, skin dulled from fatigue, eyes clouded by sleeplessness and grief. But there was strength there, too. A tightness in the jaw, a lift in the chin. She dressed, applied light makeup, and stood when the handler returned. "You'll be number 14, the woman said, pinning a small silver badge to the side of Taryn's dress. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not engage with other guests. You're not required to smile. Taryn blinked. Not required to smile? No, this is not a cocktail party. The words chilled her more than she expected. This wasn't about seduction. This was selection. The women were led to the side of a grand ballroom through a private entrance. Soft chamber music played from a string quartet in the corner, and the room sparkled with light from an enormous chandelier suspended above a parquet floor. Men milled about in tuxedos and tailored suits, drinking from long-stemmed glasses, speaking in hushed voices. There were no name tags, no visible signs of wealth, but it was clear. This was power gathered in flesh and bone. These were the men who didn't need to flaunt what they owned. They were arranged in a semicircle, each woman standing behind a subtle black line on the floor. One by one, numbers were called, and women stepped forward. Taryn watched as a woman in a red dress was bid on by 3 different men. The auctioneer didn't speak. There was no hammer or shouted prices. It all happened with tablets and glances, head nods and discreet hand signals. A silent economy of control. When it was Taryn's turn, her number echoed once in the air from a voice near the curtain. 14. She stepped forward, her breath catching in her throat as the light hit her face. She couldn't see the audience clearly. The spotlight blurred their edges, and it felt like standing on a ledge with the void staring back. Her arms remained at her sides, fingers curled slightly, eyes fixed ahead. The room shifted. A whisper, the rustle of fabric, a pause. One man raised a finger, barely a motion, and the auctioneer nodded. 40. A few murmurs, then silence. Another hand rose near the back, a deeper voice. 50. This voice was unlike the others, older, firm, resonant in the bones. A few heads turned. One of the staff looked up sharply. The room waited. No other hands moved. Sold. Taryn didn't move. Not at first. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. The handler approached and gently touched her elbow. Come, she said. She was taken through a side exit and into a private room where a man in a black suit waited with a folder. The papers inside were crisp and minimal. A new contract stipulating her obligations. She would reside in a private home for the duration of the pregnancy. Her daughter's medical expenses would be fully covered. She would receive an initial payment upon relocation and the rest upon delivery. All services and costs were prepaid. Any deviation from the terms would nullify the agreement. She would not have custody. She would not request contact. She signed. There was no ceremony to it. No further instructions. A driver waited outside. She was escorted alone this time, down another corridor, into the parking garage again, and into a new car. This one darker, sleeker, with tinted windows so thick the world outside disappeared. The drive was long. Over an hour passed as they moved away from the city, through wooded highways and winding mountain roads. The darkness deepened with every mile, until even the occasional streetlight became a rarity. Snowflakes began to fall as they climbed higher, not yet thick, but swirling in the beams of the headlights like ash. Eventually, the car turned onto a private road lined with pine trees. At the end stood a sprawling modern home, glass and steel framed against the night sky, its silhouette both elegant and imposing. Lights glowed from inside, but not brightly, as if the house preferred shadow. She was not greeted by staff. The door opened to the same man who had made the final bid, tall, white-haired, bearing a cane not for effect but out of necessity. He looked at her with eyes that had known war, sorrow, and solitude, and without a word he stepped aside and let her in. The interior was minimalist. White walls, wide windows, dark stone floors. Everything was clean, silent, ordered. He led her down a hallway to a room with a large bed, thick curtains, and a view of the valley below. A closet had been stocked with clothing in her size. A bathroom shimmered with polished marble. There was a small table beside the window, all ready set for one. "You'll find everything you need here," he said finally, his voice low and precise. "You'll be seen by a doctor tomorrow. Meals will be delivered. Your phone has limited access, but you may speak with your daughter through video once per day." Taryn nodded. She didn't trust her voice. "If you require anything, speak to Miriam. She doesn't talk much, but she listens." He left without another word. Taryn stood in the middle of the room and exhaled slowly. The silence felt deeper here, more permanent. This wasn't a place of punishment, but of containment. She wasn't chained, but she wasn't free either. She walked to the window and opened the curtains. Snow had begun to blanket the trees below, quieting the world into white. Somewhere out there, her daughter was sleeping in a bed she hadn't seen. And here she stood, in silk and shadow, bought and owned by a man who hadn't yet said her name. She didn't cry. Not then. Instead, she pulled off the heels, undressed carefully, folded the gown, and lay down in the bed. The sheets smelled of cedar and soap. The mattress cradled her body like water, but it didn't feel like rest. It felt like waiting. And the snow kept falling. Morning came not with light, but with silence. The thick curtains in Taryn's room muted even the suggestion of sunrise, and when she stirred beneath the heavy blanket, for a moment she forgot where she was. The sheets were too clean, the mattress too soft, her muscles too relaxed. Then the memory returned, not in fragments, but as one solid weight settling back into her chest. The auction, the drive, the man, this house. She lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, letting the unfamiliar stillness wrap around her like fog. Her body ached in places she hadn't noticed the night before, her lower back, her neck, the bottoms of her feet. The dress shoes had left faint bruises on her skin. Slowly, she sat up, clutching the edge of the blanket to her chest. The room looked the same as when she had arrived, pristine, sterile, intentional. The windows, tall and narrow, let in just a sliver of gray morning light through the sheer edges of the curtains. A tray had been placed on the table near the window. She hadn't heard anyone come in. On it was breakfast, oatmeal with berries, a boiled egg, tea, and a glass of water. Everything arranged neatly, like in a hotel. No note, no greeting, just sustenance. She rose, washed her face in the adjoining bathroom, and dressed in one of the outfits left in the wardrobe. Gray sweatpants, a long-sleeved shirt, and wool socks. All high quality. All her size. The tag on the shirt had been removed. Someone had thought of everything. She ate slowly, every bite deliberate, her thoughts never far from Maya. Had she eaten yet? Had someone brushed her hair, helped her dress, told her everything would be okay? Was she asking for her mother? After the meal, Taryn paced the room. It was large, but not lavish. There were no paintings on the walls, only a single bookshelf with a handful of novels and a framed black and white photograph of a boy standing in front of a treehouse. The boy looked to be 10, with a gap in his front teeth and a baseball cap turned backward on his head. She didn't recognize the tree in the background, but the photo had been placed carefully, deliberately on the shelf. Not decoration. Memory. There was a knock on the door at precisely 9 o'clock. When she opened it, a woman stood there in a pale blue uniform, her graying hair tied back in a tight bun. She didn't smile, but her expression was calm. "Miss Fields," she said, I'm Miriam. I'll be taking you to the medical wing." Medical wing. The phrase made Taryn's stomach clench. She nodded mutely and followed the woman down the hall. The house revealed more of itself as they walked. Wide corridors with hardwood floors and recessed lighting, tall windows overlooking the snow-covered valley, occasional pieces of abstract art hung with precision. There was no clutter, no warmth. It was like walking through a museum that someone happened to live in. They reached a small clinic-like room on the lower floor, outfitted with medical equipment and the sterile smell of antiseptic. A doctor in his 60s greeted her with a kind smile and a gentle handshake. His name was Dr. Haskins. He was soft-spoken, meticulous, and, to Taryn's surprise, respectful. His examination was routine. Vitals, blood work, a scan. He asked questions about her health history, about Maya's birth, about any complications she might have had. She answered carefully, watching for signs of judgment. There were none. "You're in good shape," he said when the exam was done. "This procedure should be straightforward. You'll be given a full schedule soon. Meals, rest, light exercise. We prefer a peaceful environment for gestation." He didn't mention the client. Not once. Taryn didn't ask. The days began to blur. Each morning, a tray of food appeared. Miriam would come with updates on her schedule. Checkups, walks, time in the reading room. Once a week, she was allowed a 10-minute video call with Maya. The girl seemed healthy, cheerful even, surrounded by pastel walls and a kind-faced nurse who handed her the tablet with a smile. But the distance in Maya's voice, the echo in the connection, the way she said, "I love you," before the screen went dark, it all reminded Taryn how little control she had. Her daughter was safe, but she was no longer hers, not fully. She lived now in the space between screens and promises. Ulysses, the man who had purchased her, did not return. Not at first. She occasionally caught glimpses of him through windows or at the far end of a hallway. He walked with a slow, steady limp, always with his cane, always dressed in dark clothing. He never looked hurried, but he never lingered either. Like everything else in the house, his presence was managed. Taryn learned to keep herself busy. She read novels from the small library, took long walks around the fenced perimeter of the grounds, and wrote letters she never sent. She knitted a scarf from wool provided by Miriam, though she had never done it before. Her hands needed something to do, anything to keep from shaking. But the isolation wore on her, the silence, the stillness, the knowledge that she had agreed to this, that she had allowed herself to be purchased. 2 weeks passed before he spoke to her again. It happened in the most mundane way. She was sitting in the reading room, a thick plaid blanket over her knees, flipping through a copy of Baldwin's Giovanni's Room. The fire crackled softly nearby, more for sound than warmth. She didn't hear him come in. "I always liked that one," he said. She looked up sharply. He stood by the door, watching her with those unblinking gray eyes. She didn't answer. He walked slowly to a chair opposite hers and sat. No introductions, no apology for the silence, just a presence. "I put that book there a long time ago," he said. "No one ever touched it." She closed the book, resting it on her lap. "I didn't expect you to read," he added. "Why?" He tilted his head. "Most people in your position don't." Taryn's jaw tensed. "People in my position?" He met her gaze. "I mean, no insult. I only meant you're different." She said nothing. The fire snapped in the hearth. After a long pause, he spoke again. "I'm Walter. Walter Grayson." She nodded once. The name meant nothing to her. He sat there for a while longer, not asking questions, not making demands. Just being. When he stood to leave, he said, If you need anything, let Miriam know. After that, his visits became more frequent. Sometimes he'd appear in the evening with a tray of fruit, other times in the afternoon with a new book or a puzzle. He never stayed long, never crossed any lines. But slowly, the shape of his presence shifted from imposing to curious. One day, she asked, "Why me?" He paused, standing near the window with a mug of tea in his hand. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting in slow motion. "You didn't cry," he said. She blinked. "What?" "When you stood there at the auction," he said without turning. "You didn't cry. You didn't beg. You looked resolved. I respected that." Respect. The word caught her off guard. In the days that followed, he began to speak more freely. He told her about his childhood in rural Oregon, about his engineering work overseas, about the wife he lost in a helicopter crash, about the son who had followed her 6 months later, taken by leukemia. He said it all quietly, as if stating facts. "I stopped believing in permanence," he said one evening. "Contracts are easier than feelings." Taryn listened, but didn't respond. She didn't trust his words yet. Didn't trust the warmth she sometimes saw in his face when he looked at her knitting, or when he left extra snacks on her tray. She knew better than to confuse gestures with safety, but she couldn't deny the change in the air. The house, once cold and impenetrable, now seemed to soften at the edges. Lights were warmer, blankets thicker. Music played sometimes in the background. She found herself humming as she walked, and when she touched her belly, flat still, but waiting, she no longer felt only fear. There was something else, something she dared not name. One evening, he brought a radio. "It belonged to my son," he said. "He used to play jazz at night, said it helped him sleep." She accepted it without comment. That night, she turned the knob and let the music fill the room. Saxophone, soft drums, the gentle murmur of something alive. She sat by the window, watching the snow fall over the mountains, and wondered what kind of life was growing, not just inside her, but around her. The silence no longer felt like a prison. It felt like possibility. The transition from winter to spring in the Colorado mountains was almost imperceptible. It began not with warmth, but with a slight thinning of the snow. The wind no longer bit with the same merciless sharpness. The sun, though still pale and tentative, lingered longer on the horizon each evening, casting softer shadows through the tall windows of the Grayson estate. Taryn noticed these changes the way someone drowning might notice a shift in the current. Small things, but enough to suggest motion, even if not yet rescue. She began rising earlier, sometimes before the breakfast tray arrived. Her walks extended beyond the inner garden to the western slope, where patches of earth peeked through the snow and birds began to return. One morning, she found a tiny yellow flower pushing up between two rocks. She crouched down to touch it, her fingers hovering just above the fragile petals as if to ask whether it, too, had been waiting to breathe. Her body was changing. The subtle heaviness in her hips and chest, the tightening in her lower abdomen, the sudden bursts of fatigue, all of it confirming what she already knew but still refused to name aloud. The baby was growing. Inside her, the contract had taken root. But so had something else, something unexpected, a flicker of ownership, of connection. She told herself it was biology, a trick of hormones, nothing more. But sometimes, when she lay on her side at night with her hand resting over her belly, she whispered promises that no one else could hear. Walter's presence had grown more regular, though no less restrained. He visited in the afternoons now, often unannounced, sometimes bringing books, sometimes nothing at all. One day, he brought her a potted herb garden, parsley, basil, and mint, and left it on the windowsill of her room. "You strike me as someone who needs to grow things," he said, not waiting for her response before disappearing back down the hall. Another time, he brought her a scarf made of thick alpaca wool and placed it silently on the back of her chair. When she asked where it came from, he said he had knitted it himself during the pandemic. She didn't believe him at first, but when he described the mistakes in the pattern and the way the yarn tangled if pulled too tightly, she realized he hadn't just made it. He remembered making it. That kind of patience, that kind of quiet dedication, unsettled her. They talked more now, not out of obligation, but out of rhythm. He would speak about the vineyards he once toured in Spain, the machines he helped design in Qatar, the books he never finished reading. She listened without judgment, letting his voice fill the spaces where loneliness had once lived. He never pried, never asked for her past. Perhaps he thought he already knew it. Perhaps he was afraid to know more. One afternoon, they sat together in the reading room, the sun casting long golden lines across the carpet. Taryn was knitting again, her hands moving almost without thought, while Walter sipped coffee beside her. "Do you miss it?" she asked quietly. He looked up, confused. "What?" "Whatever life you had before this house, before the quiet." He was quiet for a long time. "Yes," he said finally, "and no, I miss the certainty, but not the noise." She nodded, understanding more than she wanted to admit. That evening, she found a manila envelope on her pillow. Inside was a new contract. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the papers. It was similar to the first agreement, but with one crucial change. After the birth, she would be allowed to stay, on the condition that she relinquished all rights to the child. She could live in the house, have her daughter returned to her, be cared for indefinitely, but the baby would be his. Entirely. No questions, no claims, no future involvement. She sat on the bed for a long time, the contract in her lap. Her room felt smaller than before, the walls closer, the ceiling lower. The floor under her feet might as well have been the auction stage again. Her throat burned. Later that night, she went to the fire pit in the back garden. The wind had died and the air was dry. She didn't bring a coat. In her hand, she held the contract. She lit a match and watched it catch, feeding the flame to the edge of the paper. The fire crept across the page like a living thing, devouring the black ink and legalese until nothing remained but ash. When Walter found her there, she was still staring at the embers. "I'm not a product," she said before he could speak, "and my child is not a transaction." His face betrayed no emotion, but his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "I thought I was giving you something, a life without worry." "You were buying silence," she replied. He didn't argue. For 3 days, she didn't see him. Meals arrived on time, Miriam said nothing, and the house felt colder again. Taryn tried to distract herself, reading, knitting, writing, but her thoughts kept returning to the fire, to the look on his face. On the 4th night, she woke to find her room dimly lit by a lamp she hadn't turned on. Walter was sitting in the chair by the window, his cane resting against the wall. He looked tired, not from lack of sleep but from carrying something too heavy for too long. "You're right," he said simply. She didn't ask what he meant. She just waited. "I spent years building walls around everything. My company, my house, my heart. But walls don't keep out grief. They just keep out people." She sat up slowly, her hands resting over her belly. "I didn't come here to take," he continued. "I came here to feel safe. and I thought control was the same thing, but it's not. He stood slowly, gripping the cane. If you want to leave after the birth, I'll make sure you have whatever you need. No contracts, no expectations, just freedom. She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time saw a man who wasn't powerful or mysterious, but simply human. Flawed, afraid, trying. That night, as the snow melted outside and the wind hummed through the trees, she stepped close to him, slowly, cautiously. He didn't move, didn't reach for her. She rested her hand gently on his arm. You didn't have to build a wall, she said. You could have just opened a door. He swallowed hard, and in his eyes she saw something break. Quietly, gratefully. They stood like that for a long time. Two people who had nothing left to hide, no reason to pretend. No longer buyer and contract, no longer prisoner and warden. Just a man. And a woman. And the life between them beginning to grow louder than the silence that had once filled every room. It was the wind that woke her. Taryn sat upright in the dim light of early dawn, hand instinctively flying to her belly. For a second, she wasn't sure what had stirred her, the dream that lingered just outside memory, or the strange tension in the air that seemed to vibrate through the windows. The house was quiet, as always, but something in its silence felt off. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet sinking into the rug, and exhaled slowly. The baby inside her rolled gently in response, a flutter of movement that made her press her palm against her skin. She had become accustomed to the rhythms of her body now, to the slow and powerful transformation unfolding day by day. The bump had grown into a round, solid presence, and her steps had grown heavier, slower. Her back ached more frequently. Her appetite shifted constantly, but more than anything, she had begun to feel a connection that frightened her, not because it was unnatural, but because it was very real. This child, this life inside her was no longer an abstract contract. It was a heartbeat, a spirit, a whisper that spoke to her every time she closed her eyes. And it was hers, entirely. She dressed slowly, choosing the soft cotton dress Miriam had left for her the night before. Her belly pulled the fabric forward, and she had to sit briefly to catch her breath after bending down for her slippers. The windows showed a gray and restless sky. Clouds hung low, as though the world were holding something back. In the kitchen, she found Walter already there, stirring milk into a steaming mug of coffee. He glanced up when she entered, but said nothing right away. She noted the faint lines beneath his eyes, the stiffness in his shoulders. Something weighed on him, too. "You're up early," he said finally, sliding the extra mug toward her. "Couldn't sleep," she replied, wrapping both hands around the warmth of the cup. The room felt dense with unspoken thoughts. Taryn sat across from him at the small breakfast table, sipping in silence. He watched her with a look she couldn't decipher, half wary, half reverent. "I had papers drawn up," he said at last. She didn't flinch. She had expected this moment. "The contract," he added, "has been rewritten." Her grip on the mug tightened. "I thought we were past that," she said. "I thought so too," he admitted, but the lawyers insisted. Technicalities, protection, clarity. "It's not binding, just language." She didn't respond. The weight of paper was something she knew all too well. A few signatures could change the course of a life, unravel identity, define ownership. "Clarity," he said, "but whose?" After breakfast, he left the new document on her nightstand. He didn't pressure her to read it, didn't hover, but the presence of it seeped into the walls like a toxin. Taryn tried to distract herself, tended to the herbs by the window, read for an hour, took a walk along the perimeter of the property, but everywhere she turned, the thought followed her. It sat with her as she rocked slowly in the chair near the fireplace, her belly heavy, her breath shallower than usual. It whispered when she tried to nap, slipping into her dreams and filling them with shadows of courtrooms, cries, broken promises. By nightfall, she could no longer resist. She opened the folder. It was everything he'd said. The revised contract clearly stated that she would have the option to remain in the house, even indefinitely, after the child's birth. She would be compensated. Her daughter would be returned to her immediately. She would have autonomy, comfort, security, but she would have to surrender any and all maternal rights to the child she now carried. It was written in clean, unemotional language. Legal neutrality, void of cruelty, void of empathy. She read it 3 times, then she tore it in half, then again, and again. Later that evening, Walter knocked on her door. When she didn't answer, he entered quietly. She was sitting on the floor, surrounded by shreds of paper. He looked down at the pieces, then back at her, his face unreadable. "I'm not currency," she said, "and this baby, is not a promise you get to control." His jaw flexed, but he didn't argue. "I know," he said after a long pause. I thought I could give you something solid, something certain." "What you offered wasn't certainty," she said. "It was a cage with velvet lining." He nodded once, slowly, and stepped back. "I won't mention it again," he said. True to his word, he didn't, but something shifted between them after that. A carefulness crept back in. Conversations became shorter. The warmth of previous days cooled to a steady, polite neutrality. Miriam noticed too. Her glance lingered longer, her tone softer when delivering tea or adjusting pillows. Even the house seemed to feel it. The fireplace was lit less often. The music paused. Taryn hated it. She hated that the truth had made things harder, that she could feel the distance Walter was putting between them again. She hated that it hurt. One afternoon, as a storm brewed on the horizon and wind battered the windows, she caught sight of him walking the path near the orchard, alone. He paused to touch the bark of one of the trees, tilting his head upward to the budding branches. He stood there for a long time, unmoving. That night, she waited for him by the fire. When he didn't come, she walked down to the study where he kept his books and work files. The door was ajar. He was inside, sitting at the piano. His fingers weren't playing, just resting on the keys, like someone remembering a song they hadn't yet decided to play again. She stepped in and stood silently for a while before speaking. "You once said you stopped believing in permanence." He looked up at her, startled. "I think," she continued, "you also stopped believing in forgiveness." He watched her, breath held. "I'm not asking you to change," she said, "but if you want to share anything with me, it has to be real, not contractual, not transactional, just real." He rose slowly, came to stand in front of her. "I don't know how," he said. She nodded. "Then let's learn together." The walls cracked further that night, not with violence, not with drama, but with quiet, mutual surrender. They didn't kiss, they didn't touch. They sat side by side on the long leather couch, letting silence hold them in place. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He didn't move. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside, for the first time in days, there was peace. The next week passed differently. Walter became attentive again, but not in the way of before. He brought her books with bookmarks tucked inside where he thought she might like a passage. He asked her opinions on articles he read. He brought her fresh-baked bread from a nearby town and told her about the old man who ran the bakery, who had lost 2 fingers but could knead dough with more precision than anyone alive. He didn't talk about the baby, but he began noticing her comfort. He asked if she needed new shoes when her ankles swelled. He bought a glider for the nursery she had begun assembling, though she hadn't told him she'd started. It appeared overnight. They spent time on the back terrace in the mornings, where the sun had begun to warm the stone tiles again. The mountains were shedding their snow now. Earth was returning. Green touched the edges of every path. Then, one morning, he asked if she'd like to take a trip. Where? She asked cautiously. Somewhere simple, not far, somewhere I can breathe. They drove for 2 hours through dusty, winding roads into a valley surrounded by low hills and thin vineyards just beginning to wake from winter. At the end of the road stood a modest farmhouse. Its walls were weathered, its windows open. The air smelled of soil and fermenting grapes. An old man greeted Walter with a smile and a slap on the back. No questions, no suspicion. Taryn was welcomed with lemonade, a straw hat, and a chair under a fig tree. They stayed the whole afternoon. She watched Walter laugh with the workers, taste wine from clay mugs, wipe dirt from his hands with an old towel. He looked younger, not in body, but in spirit, untethered. As they drove back, the sun setting in streaks of orange and crimson, she sat quietly beside him, watching his profile. "You looked free today," she said softly. He didn't respond for a moment. Then he glanced at her and said, "That's who I was before I started building walls." She reached for his hand. "And who you still are," she whispered. That night, no new contracts appeared. No folders, no ultimatums, only a warm blanket folded beside her pillow, and silence that no longer threatened but waited, open, whole, human. It began just after 2 in the morning. Taryn awoke with a start, the air in her lungs catching as something deep inside her body shifted. Not just discomfort or pressure, but pain, sharp, urgent, and wholly unfamiliar. She gasped, her hand flying instinctively to her belly, now massive and taut under the soft cotton of her nightgown. Another wave came, stronger this time, like a band of fire tightening around her spine and wrapping through her abdomen. She tried to sit up, but the movement brought with it a pulse of agony that stole her breath. She cried out before she could stop herself. Seconds later, the door to her room burst open. Walter stood in the doorway, disheveled and breathless, his face pale. "Taryn?" he said quickly, crossing the room. She nodded, wincing. "It's time." He didn't hesitate. Within minutes, he had thrown on clothes and summoned Miriam, who arrived in her robe but with the efficiency of a nurse who had prepared for this moment down to the last detail. A small go-bag had already been packed in the hallway. Walter took the keys to the SUV himself, refusing Miriam's offer to drive. The air outside was cold, but still, a blanket of dew glistening under the moonlight as they helped Taryn into the back seat. The drive to the clinic was a blur. Taryn curled against the seat, her hands gripping the side handle as the contractions tore through her with relentless rhythm. She tried to focus on the passing of time, on the fading stars overhead, on the distant treetops that lined the winding road. Walter kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting near her shoulder, steadying her with calm words she couldn't process. He said her name over and over again, not as a command or a plea, but as an anchor. By the time they reached the private clinic nestled on the edge of the forest, dawn had begun to push against the horizon. Pale light seeped through the treetops as nurses met them at the emergency entrance, already prepared. The medical team, briefed weeks in advance by Dr. Haskins, moved into action with seamless precision. Taryn was placed on a stretcher and wheeled inside. She could feel the tremble of Walter's hand as he brushed hers before she was guided away. Inside the delivery room, the light was sterile and too bright. She squinted, gasping between contractions. The pain had escalated into a near-constant throb, the space between each wave shrinking until it felt like one long, undulating storm of pressure. Nurses surrounded her, checking monitors, adjusting IVs, placing oxygen against her lips. Dr. Haskins arrived shortly after and took her hand with a firm, reassuring grip. "You're doing beautifully," he said. "We're ready when you are." Walter appeared beside her moments later, dressed in surgical scrubs, his expression drawn tight with worry. He had never looked so exposed. His usual composure was gone, replaced by something raw and unsure. When he took her hand, she clutched it with desperate force. "I'm right here," he whispered. "I'm not leaving." Time lost all shape. The contractions came like waves crashing against the shore, each stronger than the last. Her body, slick with sweat, arched against the pain. She gritted her teeth and pushed when told, her screams tearing through the sterile calm of the room. Walter remained at her side, holding her hand, his eyes fixed on hers with a fierce and terrified loyalty. He whispered to her, not out of instruction, but as a lifeline. Soft, steady, unwavering. She thought of Maya. She thought of the nights spent in the back seat of that car, of vending machines and blankets that weren't warm enough. Of the tears she had hidden from her daughter, of the promises whispered through fear. She thought of what it meant to bring a child into the world, not as part of a contract or a transaction, but as an act of defiance, of love. And then, all at once, it happened. A final, blistering push, and then release. The room fell into sudden quiet. Taryn blinked through the sweat in her eyes, through the blur of tears and exhaustion. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of her heartbeat in her ears and the faint buzz of medical equipment, then the cry. A thin, powerful wail that shattered the stillness and filled her chest with something too big for words. Relief, awe, terror, joy, it all bled together. The nurse lifted the newborn into view, red-faced, flailing, impossibly small, and impossibly perfect. "It's a boy," the nurse said, her voice bright with wonder. They placed him on Taryn's chest, and as she looked down at him, time seemed to slow. His skin was warm and damp, his tiny fingers curling toward her instinctively. She sobbed, not from pain, but from release, from the knowledge that he was real, that he was alive, that she had brought him here. Walter stood beside her, unmoving, his face slack with emotion. Slowly, cautiously, he reached out and touched the baby's head with his fingertips. Then, with a trembling hand, he lifted the child into his arms. The boy's cries softened at his touch, and Walter let out a choked breath. "I never thought," he whispered, his voice breaking, "that I'd ever feel this again." Taryn watched him, her heart stretching in ways she had never imagined possible. There was no barrier now, no performance. He was just a man, holding a piece of his future, weeping without shame. He turned to her. "He'll know," he said. "He'll know who you are. He'll know where he came from, I promise." There was no document, no contract, just a vow. After they cleaned the baby and ran the tests, after the quiet bustle of nurses slowed and the lights dimmed, they were left alone. Taryn lay in bed, her body sore, her breath shallow. The child rested in the crook of her arm, sleeping soundly, his tiny chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Walter sat in the chair beside them, watching, still dressed in scrubs, still too stunned to speak much. When the nurse returned, she offered Walter a blanket and asked if he'd like to rest. He shook his head. "I'll stay." He stayed through the morning, through the late afternoon, and into the next night. He watched every movement of the baby, every soft twitch and sigh. When the baby cried, he helped change diapers, rocked him gently, and paced the room until the child quieted. He wasn't graceful. He fumbled, dropped the burp cloth, forgot to support the baby's head the first time. But he tried, and tried again. Taryn slept in short bursts, her body too exhausted to stay conscious for long. But each time she woke, Walter was still there. On the second night, as the room quieted and the baby dozed in the bassinet, Walter sat with his hands clasped between his knees, staring out the window into the dark. "I was terrified," he said, not looking at her. "Not just tonight, from the beginning, of becoming attached, of failing again." "You haven't failed," she said softly. "I've lost a child before, Taryn, and when you lose something that large, you forget how to carry joy, because joy feels dangerous." She reached out and took his hand. His fingers were cold. She wrapped hers around them. "This isn't a contract anymore," she said. "This is a beginning." He looked at her then, eyes rimmed red, the weight of years falling from his shoulders. "Then I want to do it right this time." They named the baby Elijah. The discharge papers were signed 3 days later, but neither of them mentioned any timeline for departure. There was no sense of urgency, just a quiet return to the house that no longer felt like a fortress. When they arrived, the staff welcomed them with rare warmth, and a new room, prepared in advance, awaited Elijah, complete with soft lights, bookshelves, a rocking chair, and walls painted in gentle blue. Taryn stood in the doorway holding her son, stunned by the tenderness of the space. Walter watched her without speaking. Then, gently, he took her hand and kissed her knuckles. "I had the room built 2 months ago," he said, "but I only knew yesterday what it was really for." That night, she fed Elijah by the fire while Maya's voice came through the video call, excited and full of questions. The nurse on the other end smiled and said Maya would be ready to come home in just a few days. Home. The word no longer sounded like a borrowed thing. It felt earned, and as Elijah slept, curled against her shoulder, and Walter sat beside her, his arm draped behind her back, Taryn let herself believe, for the first time in a long time, that the worst was behind them, that what had begun in silence could, at last, grow in love. It had been 6 months since the morning Elijah was born, and already it felt as though the world had rearranged itself around him. The stillness of the house had changed, not in volume but in tone. It no longer breathed like a museum or echoed like an empty estate. There was life now in the way the floor creaked under soft steps, and the rustle of blankets during midnight feedings, and the occasional tiny sneeze that made both Walter and Taryn freeze and glance towards the cradle with equal parts alarm and wonder. There was life in the new sounds, the new silences, the new rhythm. Outside, the mountain had shed its final layers of frost and bloomed in quiet strength. The orchard trees, once bare and skeletal, now burst with color and the scent of budding fruit. Bees wandered lazily through sunlit gardens and birds built nests under the eaves. Nature had moved on from winter. And so, it seemed, had they. Walter kept his promise. There were no contracts, no forms, no assumptions. After the clinic, he never once attempted to redefine their dynamic. Instead, he opened space. He allowed time to shape what once was bound by ink and signature. Taryn remained in the house not because she was expected to, but because she wanted to. No one asked her to stay. No one forced her to explain. She simply woke each morning in the same room where she had once torn a contract to pieces and chose again to stay. The nursery, which she and Walter now called Elijah's room without hesitation, had grown into a sanctuary. The soft blue walls had been joined by shelves filled with storybooks, baskets of handmade toys, and warm blankets that Taryn sewed herself on the quiet afternoons when Elijah napped. There was a mobile above the crib made of tiny felt stars and clouds, crafted by hand in a flurry of trial and error one stormy weekend when the wind kept everyone inside. Taryn had pricked her fingers repeatedly, trying to get the stitches right. Walter had burned dinner attempting to make stew. They'd both laughed with flour on their cheeks and a crying baby between them. Maya returned a week after Elijah's birth. She came home on a bright, windless morning, holding the hand of a nurse who barely had time to say goodbye before the little girl ran toward her mother, arms flung wide, eyes shining with something more than excitement, certainty. Taryn knelt in the grass. Elijah swaddled against her chest and held her daughter as tightly as she could with one arm. The girl's voice chattered endlessly, filling the air with a joy so pure it brought tears to Walter's eyes. He'd watched from the porch and later admitted with quiet honesty that it was the first time in 10 years he'd cried out of happiness. Maya adjusted quickly to life in the house. The clinic had been kind to her, but it had not been home. Home, she decided, was where she could paint her own name on the bedroom door in glitter, where Elijah's tiny fingers curled around hers as he lay in his bassinet, where she could help in the kitchen and learn how to plant tomatoes in the raised beds Walter had built just for her. She asked questions constantly, narrated every part of her day, and assigned herself the official title of Big Sister in Charge. No one objected. Walter, to everyone's surprise, including his own, took to fatherhood again with a strange, clumsy grace. He approached it not with the control he was known for, but with an openness born from fear and forgiveness. He read parenting books late into the night, took notes, and tried, really tried. He swaddled poorly, rocked too fast, mixed formula with a precision more suited to engineering than feeding, and once accidentally put the baby's diaper on backward. But he never gave up. When Elijah cried, he came. When Maya wanted help building a cardboard castle in the living room, he canceled the meeting. He made mistakes, but he showed up, over and over again. And Taryn watched it all, not from a distance, not as a guest, but as something else entirely, an equal. The dynamic between them shifted, gradually but unmistakably. The looks they shared held no trace of contract or transaction. They shared stories now, and space. They finished each other's thoughts. She teased him gently when he forgot the bottle warmer in the microwave. He brought her wildflowers from the edge of the woods without ceremony, leaving them by the sink as if they'd always been there. In the evenings, when the children were asleep and the house had grown quiet again, they sat together on the back terrace wrapped in blankets, sipping tea or wine, watching the light fade behind the trees. They didn't always talk. Sometimes they simply listened, to the wind, to the creak of settling wood, to each other's breathing. That silence no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. It was on one such evening that Walter rose from his chair slowly, the lines around his eyes softened by the low orange glow of the lantern. He didn't carry anything, not even a ring. He simply turned to face her. "I was wrong before," he said, "about needing walls, about thinking safety came from structure." Taryn looked up, her legs curled beneath her, a mug warm in her hands. "You showed me something I didn't believe I'd ever see again," he said. "You gave me back a life I didn't think I deserved." She didn't interrupt. She just waited, steady and patient. He took a breath. "I want to ask you to stay, not out of duty, not because of the baby, not because of the past, but because I've never been more certain about anything than I am about you." Her eyes filled, but she didn't speak. Instead, she set her mug down and rose to meet him. He didn't kneel. He didn't offer promises he couldn't keep. He just stood there, the cool mountain breeze shifting his shirt, and held out his hand. She took it. They didn't need declarations. The path they'd walked said everything. The nights of shared silence, the laughter over spilled cereal, the hours spent folding tiny clothes and navigating chaos. It all pointed to something neither of them had planned, but had built nonetheless. From then on, their days followed a new rhythm. Not perfect, not easy, but real. Elijah grew quickly, his laughter loud and musical, his presence the unspoken center of their home. Maya thrived in the attention, becoming her brother's protector, helper, and favorite entertainer. Walter continued to learn, his former life as a businessman receding behind long walks with a stroller, surprise art shows in the kitchen, and late-night conversations about things that mattered more than stock portfolios. The staff in the house adjusted too. Miriam, who had once served with quiet formality, now left puzzles for Maya on the breakfast table and carried Elijah with practiced ease while humming old folk songs. The housekeeper decorated the common room with children's art. The chef began experimenting with dishes that looked suspiciously like the ones Taryn used to make in their leaner days. Simple, filling, full of soul. The mountain, too, bore witness. Each season it bloomed and folded in on itself, echoing the changes within the walls of the house. As summer gave way to early fall, the leaves turned amber and crimson. The children grew taller. Taryn and Walter, once strangers bound by desperation, now found themselves curled around one another in sleep, their bodies instinctively drawn together. On Elijah's first trip to the orchard, he reached out for a pear still too high to touch, and Walter lifted him with a gentleness that made Taryn's throat tighten. Maya ran ahead, declaring herself queen of the trees. Taryn trailed behind them, her heart full, her steps slow, the sun warming her skin as laughter echoed off the stone walls of the house in the distance. That evening, she sat in the nursery with Elijah asleep on her chest, the rocking chair creaking in soft rhythm. Walter stood by the doorway, arms folded, just watching. "She looks like she belongs here," he said, nodding toward Maya's glitter-covered sneakers near the crib. "We all do," Taryn replied. And for the first time in her life, she truly believed it. No one needed to explain it. No one needed to justify how something born in desperation had become a family. It simply was. A home, a bond, a beginning. Later, as twilight settled over the mountains, Maya brought a drawing into the living room and held it up proudly. In thick crayon lines, she had drawn 4 figures beneath a bright yellow sun. A girl, a baby, a tall man, and a woman with curly hair and smiling eyes. Above them, in bold, uneven letters, were 3 words: "This is us." Taryn smiled, took the paper in her hands, and kissed her daughter's cheek. And outside the window, where once there had only been snow and silence, the sky glowed with the last light of day. Not a single star had risen yet, but they didn't need stars. They had built their own light. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch our next video to see what happens when fate turns again. And share this video with someone who needs to hear it.